The U.S. and Japan issued strong statements of concern over the issue, and on Tuesday, the United States confirmed that it flew 2 B-52 bombers over China's newly established air defense zone, as well as the disputed Diaoyu Islands. U.S. State Department spokesperson Jen Psaki on Tuesday expressed U.S. concern over the issue when asked about whether the United States' action should be viewed as counter-provocation. Psaki refused to comment.
This phenomena, as I say, is fairly self-evident, even if you are only looking at the headlines of today's news. But if you are only looking at the headlines, then you might have missed a very different set of data, indicating a very different and perhaps directly contradictory narrative, one that paints China and its supposed foes in the West not as allies pitted against each other, but as partners, however uneasily, in some sort of alliance that will set the tone for the 21st century.
Evelyn de Rothschild joins us now to talk about investing in China and his latest venture, Weather Central, here as well. So, Evelyn, thank you very much indeed for joining us. I just want to get your views on how things have evolved. Has it become a more open society? Has it become an easier place to do business?
Oh, I think it is, no doubt. I think it's a remarkable country. When you think of what has happened in the last 10 years, let alone 20 years, is an achievement beyond recognition.
I'm Richard Rockefeller. I'm chair of the board of the Rockefeller Brothers Fund. The sentiments that my grandfather and grandmother and actually other relatives of that generation had for China, very positive feelings for the country, passed through the generations to all of us. So China, in a way, wasn't such an unfamiliar place to us as it might have felt for a lot of Americans.
What sort of a financial deal should Obama be seeking to strike when he travels to China next month?
No, I think this would be the time, because you really need to bring China into the creation of a new world order, financial world order.
So, Evelyn, what about the RMB situation? You mentioned a so-called currency problem. I mean, do you see the day in the next 5 years where it's fully convertible and flexible?
Well, you're talking to a person who's quite old. If I'm around in 5 years, I'd like to think that that is the case. I think we've all got to move towards that opportunity, and I think the challenge also is whether we should move towards an international currency.
But they really are issues of the construction of a new world order. That's what this is about. And that's the sort of dialogue the Chinese are generally good at. And so a partnership between us is essential. A conflict between us is going to exhaust us both in tactical exercises that cannot be conclusive.
And the New World Order could satisfy both.
It has to satisfy both, because otherwise it will lead to tensions that will exhaust us both.
One has to give credit to President Nixon's and Henry Kissinger's initiative. They broke the ice. They did. But they confronted a residue of suspicion, and that suspicion was mutual, and grievances. And they were also mutual, that it really took time for the relationship to sort of become more normal, more predictable. And eventually what we accomplished was that it became, in fact, open and full, comprehensive, and in fact initiated a kind of secret collaboration, or even perhaps you could call it an alliance.
And so we have on one hand the fiery and bellicose rhetoric of the would-be belligerents of the Cold War of the 21st century, and on the other hand the conciliatory or even cooperative pronouncements of the usual gaggle of super gophers, the superclass identified by Henry Kissinger protege David Rothkopf in his recent book of the same name, that identified about 6,000 global actors able to implement transnational policy agendas thanks to their political and financial influence. Are these two positions, which seem to go head-on and seem to be completely irreconcilable, in fact resolvable if we look at this not as a two-dimensional surface-level conflict taking place between nation states or groupings of nation states on the geopolitical chessboard, but in fact a three-dimensional problem that involves hierarchies of control vying in different levels of this game for different squares, not just squares of a chessboard, but a 3D chessboard, if we can extend the metaphor. Well, in fact, that is exactly the position I would take, and as strange as that might seem, as difficult as it might be to wrap our heads around that type of conflict, which is happening at one level, which is actually cooperation at another level, it should be noted that this is not the first time in history that we've noticed this type of phenomenon. And in fact, even within the past century, we noticed very, very similar, analogous, one would almost say template or prototypical examples of this very phenomenon, as identified by a researcher who I have name-checked a number of times on this podcast in the past, so I certainly hope my regular listeners will be familiar with his work already. I am referring, of course, to Anthony C. Sudden, the author of such trade books as Wall Street and the Rise of Hitler, Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution, Wall Street and FDR, but also the author of many scholarly publications, academic publications that were published under the auspices of the Hoover Institute in the 1970s and that have been well-regarded scholarly works that were even name-checked by the likes of Zbigniew Brzezinski as being convincing proof of the thesis that these books were forwarding. And that thesis revolved around the idea that in the case of, for example, the Bolshevik Revolution or the rise of the Nazis, that it was the Western powers, specifically the financial center of Wall Street and the Wall Street bankers, who were helping to fund their supposed arch enemies, the socialists of various stripes, whether that be the Bolsheviks or the National Socialists in Germany, for their own agenda purposes.
Dr. Sutton, you wrote 3 series of books while you were a research fellow at the Hoover Institute. Can you give me basically the background of the content of these series?
Yes, the series I wrote at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University concerned the transfers of Western technology to the Soviet Union, and essentially it comprised 3 individual books. Each book covers a period of time since 1917.
And then you wrote a second series of books on Wall Street.
Yes, these were trade books. In other words, they're not academic books. They're written for the general public. They concerned the build-up of the 3 types of socialism: Bolshevik socialism in Russia, what we might call welfare socialism in the United States, and Hitlerian or National Socialism. And each book examines the financing and the contributions made by Wall Street, by international bankers, to the development of that specific form of socialism.
But the obvious question here is, why? Why on earth would these crony capitalists be funding their erstwhile, supposed, nominal, arch-nemesis rival enemies, their sworn enemies, the socialists? These are directly contradictory ideologies and viewpoints and economic systems. Why on earth would the capitalists be supporting the socialists in various countries? This seems completely nonsensical if we look at it from that, again, 2-dimensional, surface-level reality. But if we extend this out again to the 3-dimensional hierarchical reality, we start to realize that there are agendas that can be served by the crony capitalists supporting command and control economical structures and political authoritarian structures in various countries.
Just tell us all over again why.
Why?
Just tell
it again. You won't find this in the textbooks. Why is to bring about, I suspect, a plan to control world society in which you and I won't find the freedoms to believe and think and do as we believe.
Did these power brokers actually envision at that time a one-world government that would be socialist?
Yes. The second statement I made was that they did not want the Soviet Union to develop into another free enterprise society, and that this would offset it. Aiding the revolution would offset this event. That was made as a statement in 1919. You have various books, one by Gillette, the razor blade Gillette, called The City, I think it was, which laid out this corporate socialism for the world to see as early as, 1905, 1910. So around the turn of the century, you begin to see actually written statements by these internationalist businessmen of the kind of socialist empire they wanted to bring about. It's there, but these books, of course, are not included in your courses in political science and history at the regular universities.
And so we're beginning to develop a thesis that I like to think of as a revision or updating or extending of the thesis of Anthony Sutton into the 21st century US versus China paradigm, which, again, looks, I think, very similar in some ways to the US versus Russia, the US versus Nazi Germany paradigm of the 20th century. And I say it's a revision, an updating, and extending of that thesis, because I would posit that the form of the thesis that this takes when we apply it towards the supposed battle between the American capitalists and the Chinese communists is, in fact, the agenda to forward the development of a system of one world governmental control that involves the merger of capitalist and socialist systems into a system that basically contains the worst of both worlds. We have the Chinese version of red capitalism, which represents both the command and control top-down political authoritarianism and the bankster-controlled economic crony capitalism that is the model for the New World Order. But do we have any evidence for this thesis? This, of course, is the meat and potatoes of what we're talking about today, because for anyone who has not done any research into Anthony Sutton's works or read any of his books, I would like to assure you that these interview clips that we've been looking at, it's hitherto, or that you may have seen or heard online before, are really just the summation of the years and years of extensive study that Sutton did into the State Department archives and the personal correspondence of various people involved, the poring over of receipts and economic data from various corporations, and all of that hard legwork that Sutton did for years and years developed into academic scholarly books that eventually became trade books, and we are now looking at the interviews that he did trying to summarize all of that research. The actual data in that research was pretty phenomenal and phenomenally and convincingly put together by Sutton over a very long period of time. So no matter what this thesis sounds like or whether it makes sense or it doesn't make sense is irrelevant. It really is the data that we have to look at. So let's start putting some of those pieces on this chessboard and see if it makes sense as the new great game. So let's start with the idea, for example, when Sutton was talking about the rise of the Bolsheviks, the rise of the Nazis, he was talking about the various ways in which these movements were funded and supported and aided and basically built into the position that they could become the dominant forces in those societies. And do we have a parallel with the communist Chinese, obviously taking over the country in 1949 and being bitterly opposed by the Kuomintang of Chiang Kai-shek, who, of course, then retreated to Taiwan, and the battle lines were then drawn, with China, of course, claiming Taiwan as part of its natural one China territory, and, of course, Taiwan declaring itself to be an independent republic. And so things stand, and that's, of course, the very uneasy position that we remain in today, and the idea being that if China ever went and tried to militarily take Taiwan, then World War III is on, or something along those lines. So, from the perspective of that narrative, the U.S. was obviously supporters of Chiang Kai-shek and the Kuomintang. It was quite obvious that this was the case. At least that's the surface level reality. Is there convincing or interesting or definitive or persuasive or whatever kind of evidence to point to the contrary, that in fact the U.S. or not necessarily the government, but influential people in this super gopher superclass category were actually helping to support Mao and the communists? And there is actually some tantalizing clues along that path. I don't think I've found anything that I would call definitive. I've heard claims, for example, of CIA, of station chiefs having claimed that the CIA was covertly supporting Mao. I haven't actually seen any of those claims, though. I've heard them talked about, but I haven't actually tracked down the claims themselves. If anyone can help me with that, that would be much appreciated. But we'll talk more about how you can help out with this overall investigation into China and the New World Order at the end of this episode. But let's take a look at just some of the crumbs on this cookie trail that I did find in the research for this podcast episode. And we'll start with an edition of the Yale Daily News, specifically number 96 from February 29th, 1972, that is available for reading online on the Yale Library, digital library. And it contains a front page story, a very interesting one, called Yale Group Spurs Mao's Emergence. And it states William F. Buckley was not the only Yale figure connected with the presidential trip to China, of course referring to the then recent trip to China of President Nixon. Without Yale's support, Mao Zedong may have never risen from obscurity to command China. Jonathan Spence, professor of Chinese history, was the first to discover Mao Zedong's connection with Yale. The professor noted, in 1919, Mao, aged 26, was in Changsha, having finished his middle school education. He visited Peking, and while there, received his serious introduction to communist theory in Li Tachao's Marxist study group. Now, if he was to develop a reputation in socialist circles, he had to find a forum to propagate his views. At this crucial point, the Student Union of Yale and China invited Mao to take over the editorship of their journal. Mao accepted the position and changed the format of the student magazine. It would now deal with social criticism and current problems and focus on thought reorientation. Thought reorientation. That is a very intriguing name for brainwashing or reprogramming or whatever we want to call it. But again, a very tantalizing piece of the puzzle, and one that there has been a certain amount of hay made from this. There was a Yale and China connection to Mao. And Yale, of course, the home of Skull and Bones. So there is the specter of Skull and Bones over this relationship. And that, again, there has been some hay made of that connection. For example, perhaps most notably, in an oft-cited article from the January 26, 1990 edition of the New Federalist called Bush's China Policy, Skull and Bones. And this article reads, quote, George Bush, the first U.S. diplomatic representative to the People's Republic of China back in 1973, was a member of Skull and Bones. So were his father, brother, son, uncle, nephew, and several cousins. Winston Lord, the Reagan-Bush administration ambassador to China, was a member. So were his father and several other relatives. James Lilly, the current ambassador to China, was a member of Skull and Bones, as was his brother. Except during the Carter administration, every U.S. ambassador to Beijing since Kissinger's deal with Mao Zedong was a member of the same tiny Yale cult. A mere coincidence? Mao was a Yaley. Back in 1903, Yale Divinity School established a number of schools and hospitals throughout China that were collectively known as Yale in China. It has since been shown that Yale in China was an intelligence network whose purpose was to destroy the Republican movement of Sun Yat-sen on behalf of the Anglo-American establishment. The Anglo-American establishment hated Sun because he wanted to develop China. On the other hand, they loved the Chinese communists because they intended to keep China backward and were committed to growing dope. One of Yale and China's most important students was Mao Zedong. Okay, we'll end that article there. There's a little bit more that you can continue reading, and that gets into, for example, Anthony Sutton's work. But again, a fascinating piece of this puzzle, but we should note, for example, this article in the New Federalist claims that Mao was an actual student of Yale in China, although the Yale Daily News claimed that he was not a student. He was just invited for some random reason to edit the Yale in China journal, and for whatever reason took over and started his thought reorientation program that ultimately developed into the Communist Chinese movement. So again, a very, very interesting connection, and especially interesting to contemplate the connection of all of those various ambassadors to China, which again, up to the point of 1990, every single ambassador except under Carter had been a Skull and Bones member. So that's, I mean, obviously that's a very interesting connection in and of itself, but not necessarily definitive of anything. I still think there's probably more that needs to be made in a concrete sense in that connection, but obviously a lot to ponder there. And of course, that does go back to the founding of Skull and Bones, and the earliest part of it, which of course was the money from the opium trade that the Russell Trust was the holder of, and of course that family going on to be one of the founders of Skull and Bones. So again, a lot of interesting history there, but as I say, nothing that definitively shows how Yale and Skull and Bones created the Communist Chinese, but there is enough of a connection that I think more research needs to be done in that vein. However, we can tell from going forward from the time when Mao took over the country and began his absolutely horrific, abominable Great Leap Forward that resulted in the death of at least 40 million people in the starvation of that occurred in that 4-year window. 40 million people starving to death during the Great Leap Forward. It is really interesting and, well, I suppose disgusting to note the cover that he received from some very important Western politicians, perhaps unsurprisingly, with one of the most notable examples being French President François Mitterrand, who, of course, covered for Mao during one of his visits to China. We can pick this up from the New Statesman, which had a article, Mao's Great Famine, the History of China's Most Devastating Catastrophe, 1958 to 1962, which starts by saying, when François Mitterrand visited China in 1961, Mao Zedong mocked reports of famine in the country. There was no famine, he said, only a period of scarcity, an assertion that Mitterrand, who described Mao as a great scholar known in the entire world for the diversity of his genius, was happy to accept. Returning to France after his 3-week tour, Mitterrand had no doubts about his account of events. I repeat, in order to be clearly understood, there is no famine in China. Western politicians of the right shared the French socialist leader's view. After touring China in late 1960, the conservative MP for Chester, John Temple, reported that communism was working and that the country was making great progress. And as disgusting as that was, of course, another very famous, or what should be very infamous, example of a influential Western figure backing that disgusting display that we saw under the reign of Mao was, of course, the 1973 New York Times editorial by none other than David Rockefeller, under the title From a China Traveler, in which I think he infamously said, "The social experiment in China under Chairman Mao's leadership is one of the most important and successful in human history." Again, comparing that type of rhetoric to the actual actions of Mao and what was accomplished under his leadership is, well, quite the disparity. And one might ask why that would take place. But I would like to draw people's attention to a different part of that editorial, one that is much less cited, in which Rockefeller writes, "The Chinese, for their part, are faced with altering a primarily inward focus that they have pursued for a quarter century under their current leadership. We, for our part, are faced with the realization that we have largely ignored a country with 1/4 of the world's population. When one considers the profound differences in our cultural heritages and our social and economic systems, this is certain to be a long task, with much accommodation necessary on both sides." Very interesting passage, not least of which because one might well ponder who is exactly meant in that we and our. Is that America as a whole, or does that have more to do with Rockefeller, his obvious banking and oil interests, his other ties to the financial and oligarchical elite? I think the latter more so than the former. But regardless, I think that this is actually in a couched sense, a reformulation of our thesis, that ultimately the plan, the long-term game plan, has been, at least since the time of the 1970s and the opening up of China, the very idea of merging China's inward focus and its top-down control with the ideas that the West was seeking to import in terms of economic, social, historical systems. Very interesting. So, how was this actually accomplished? Again, it's one thing to talk about it in generals. How about in specifics? Well, of course, we're talking about David Rockefeller and his 1973 speech or op-ed in favor of the great socialist revolution of Mao. But it's interesting to note that the 1972 trip of Nixon to China begat the famous Vulcan phrase, for Star Trek 6 fans in the crowd, only Nixon could go to China. But actually, the phrase shouldn't be only Nixon could go to China, because Nixon was preceded in his 1972 visit to China in 1971 in a series of secret meetings that were eventually revealed of Henry Kissinger to Beijing. It was Kissinger, of course, who paved the way for Nixon to normalize relations with China. And who is Kissinger, and who does he work for? Well, again, we don't have to dig very deeply for this knowledge. In fact, we could turn to that bastion of truthiness, Wikipedia. If it's written there, it has to be true, right? It's certainly mainstream if it's written there. So, again, from David Rockefeller's own Wikipedia entry, quote, "In Henry Kissinger, Rockefeller found a political operative with an international and domestic perspective similar to his. They first met in 1954, when Kissinger was appointed a director of a seminal Council on Foreign Relations study group on nuclear weapons, of which David was a member. The relationship developed to the point that Kissinger was invited to sit on the board of trustees of the Rockefeller Brothers Fund. Rockefeller consulted with Kissinger on numerous occasions, as for example in the Chase Bank's interest in Chile and the possibility of the election of Salvador Allende in 1970, interestingly, and fully supported his Opening of China initiative in 1971 as it afforded banking opportunities for the Chase Bank." Oh yes, in this formulation, it was Rockefeller supporting Kissinger's initiative to open up China, rather than the other way around. Yeah, sure, Wikipedia. I believe that one. But regardless of the relationship, Kissinger, Rockefeller, two peas in a pod, with the same agenda, to open up China from the Mao era of Great Leap Forward, and then the Cultural Revolution, which was an interesting time in which Mao did a very astute political maneuver. Let's not say that he was a stupid man. He was a disgusting, horrible, cruel, perverse person, probably the greatest mass murderer in the history of the world, but he was not necessarily a stupid man, and one does not retain control over a country for that long in those types of revolutionary situations without some politically astute moves. And the Cultural Revolution, in some ways, although this needs a large degree of fleshing out, but can be seen as a type of counter-revolution instituted by Mao against the counter-revolutionary tendencies that were taking place within his own party. Again, it was an interesting maneuver to get the people against the Chinese Communist Party, which was turning against Mao so that he could retain his power. An interesting setup, but at any rate, the Cultural Revolution was what occurred after the Great Leap, the utter, disgusting, horrific failure of the Great Leap Forward, which managed to maintain Mao's control over the country. And then, after that point, at the point where the handover took place and Mao was out of power, we started to see a new generation of Chinese leadership taking over. And this is where the story gets extremely interesting and connects again with these same figures of Chase Manhattan, of Rockefeller, Kissinger. All of these figures come together at a very interesting point. And we'll take this from a 1986 work by Michel Chossudovsky, Towards Capitalist Restoration, where he writes, quote, "The 1979 visit of Deng Xiaoping to the US was followed in June 1980 by the equally significant encounter in Wall Street of Rong Yiring, chairman of CITIC, and David Rockefeller. The meeting, held in the penthouse of the Chase Manhattan Bank complex, was attended by senior executives of close to 300 major U.S. corporations. A major agreement was reached between Chase, CITIC, and the Bank of China involving the exchange of specialists and technical personnel to identify and define those areas of the Chinese economy most susceptible to American technology and capital infusion," end quote. Extremely interesting. Well, now we have a very solid lead, a very specific point on which to start building our case. And this is, again, the confluence of this Rong Yiren, which I'm probably mispronouncing, and let me just, of course, add the caveat to any Chinese speakers in the crowd that I apologize for butchering your language and every single name in this episode of the podcast. Rong Yiren the chairman of CITIC, which is obviously something that deserves more scrutiny, with David Rockefeller, the Chase Manhattan Bank, 300 major U.S. corporations meeting and engaging in a large agreement on technical and specialist exchange of information and personnel to identify and define those areas of the Chinese economy most susceptible to American technology and capital infusion. So who is Yang Yiren? What was CITIC? Where did this come from? How does this relate to the presidency of Deng Xiaoping? Well, let's start boiling this down in a fascinating little piece of this puzzle that was provided by Bloomberg a couple of years ago. Of course, this is not exactly hidden knowledge that was never known before this Bloomberg report, but it was interestingly summarized in a December 27th, 2012 Bloomberg report. Heirs of Mao's comrades rise as new capitalist nobility. This is a fascinating story about what was a group that was known as the Eight Immortals. And yes, I am not making that up. They're known as the Immortals. And this is a group, a new class of people who have arisen that were connected to 8 people specifically who survived the Cultural Revolution of Mao and were in high-ranking positions in the Chinese Communist Party to start implementing a very different agenda from Mao's agenda in the reign of Deng Xiaoping. So, picking up from that article, quote, "The people generally known as the 8 Immortals are now all dead, though all but 3 lived into their 90s. Their stature in China is on a par with that of George Washington and Thomas Jefferson in the US. They are Deng Xiaoping, General Wang, who fed Mao's troops, Chen Yun, who took charge of the economy when Mao assumed power in 1949, Li Qianyan, who was instrumental in the plot that ended the Cultural Revolution, Peng Zheng, who helped build China's legal system in the 1980s, Song Renchong, the party personnel chief who oversaw the rehabilitation of purged cadres after the Cultural Revolution, President Yang, who backed Deng's order to carry out the 1989 Tiananmen Square crackdown, and Bo Yibo, a former vice premier and the last of the Immortals to die at 98 in 2007. Or, in the Chinese pronunciation of these names,
邓小平、薄一波、陈云、宋任穷、彭真、王震、李先念、杨尚昆等人。
Continuing with the Bloomberg article, they emerged from the Cultural Revolution after Mao's death in 1976, during which many of them had been in internal exile, to find an economy in ruins. Gross domestic product in 1978 was $165 a person, compared with $22,462 in the US. With Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and Hong Kong booming, the Immortals were surrounded by capitalist success stories. The victorious communists had executed landlords after 1949, farms had become people's communes, factories belonged to the state. The Immortals turned that on its head in the 1980s. Farmers could lease land. Private enterprise, at first on a small scale, later bigger, was tolerated, then encouraged. Deng took the gamble that in order to stoke growth, some flies and mosquitoes could be tolerated, said Ezra Vogel, an emeritus professor at Harvard and Cambridge, Massachusetts, who wrote a 2011 biography of Deng. All right, so there you go. There is, in a nutshell, the 8 Immortals and their progeny, which now are still in control of so many different facets of the state-controlled economy there in China, that it is extremely interesting. The not strictly state-controlled anymore, the now private enterprise/state control hybrid system that China is prototyping for the New World Order system. And it's interesting, I mean, it's fascinating to look at these 8 families and the way that their connections continue to wield inordinate amounts of power over the political and economic life of China. And there's more on that in this story in Bloomberg, in other stories that have been published in Bloomberg, in various pieces of this puzzle that will be found in a million different places, which I'm going to ask your help for in helping to connect some of those pieces later on in this episode. But let's continue on and picking up that thread from the 8 Immortals and their influence back to what we were talking about earlier with that secret meeting in 1980 with Chase Manhattan and Rockefeller meeting with Yang Yiren of the CITIC group. Well, that ties into this story of the Immortals. Reading again from that Bloomberg article, within months, Wang Jun, the general's son, that's General Wang, one of the 8 Immortals, was made head of business operations at the newly formed CITIC, known then as China International Trust and Investment Corporation. The group, founded by Rong Yi-ren, was set up to attract overseas investment at a time when the country's foreign exchange reserves were $840 million. He turned it into a sprawling empire to drive China's growth. CITIC now runs China's biggest listed securities firm, backs a Beijing soccer team, and develops luxury real estate projects. China's reserves today stand at $3.3 trillion. 840 million to 3.3 trillion. So that gives you a sense of what CITIC is and how it relates to the current Chinese hierarchy. But let's focus even more closely in on that Rong Yi-ren character, who in June 1980 was meeting with Rockefeller at the top of Chase Manhattan Complex in Manhattan. We can find this from an obituary to Rong Yi-ren that was run in the time of his death. So this obituary, entitled "The Death of China's Red Capitalist and the 1949 Revolution," reads in part, quote, "In CITIC's first year of operations, Rong met with 4,000 foreign businessmen. He also enlisted Henry Kissinger, the former U.S. Secretary of State who established diplomatic relations with Beijing in 1971 as one of the company's main international advisors. Rong facilitated investment by building infrastructure in the free trade zones and helping foreign firms set up operations. Philip Wang, a Hong Kong delegate to China's National People's Congress, told the China Daily on October 28th, if not for his, Rong's, ability and vision in setting up CITIC, the pace of economic development in China would not have been so fast. By 1992, Rong's CITIC had become a business empire involved in shipping, power generation, and construction. Today, CITIC has 200 enterprises around the world and total assets of $6.3 billion US dollars. Again, that was 2005. As CITIC developed, so did Rong's private businesses. In 1979, he sent his son, Larry Rong, to Hong Kong to manage his investments there. In 2005, Larry Rong was named by Forbes magazine as China's richest man with a fortune of $1.64 billion. Billion with a B. Rong Sr. also played a key role in the further opening up of the Chinese economy after the suppression of the anti-government protests in May and June of 1989. Deng Xiaoping justified the massacre of workers and students in Tiananmen Square on the grounds that it was necessary to defend the socialist system. In reality, it was aimed at crushing the opposition of the working class to the impact of the regime's free market policies. Free market, yes, an interesting little bit of propaganda snuck in there. In 1993, Rong was promoted to Vice President of China as a symbol of Beijing's determination to accelerate market reform. As the obituary to Rong in the British Financial Times noted, the post was mainly ceremonial, but it sent a clear message. China's new blend of communist politics and market economics was here to stay, and it was the red capitalist who had shown the way. The same year, China received $111 billion of contracted foreign direct investment, nearly 4 times the amount that had been invested in the entire 10-year period from 1979 to 1989. End quote. Very interesting character, and you will notice the little bits of propaganda and the little bits of the narrative that are already being inserted into this in very, very subtle but very powerful ways. For example, it's the free trade, it's the capitalist aspects of this CITIC and these types of organizations that are to blame for the incredible oppression and political oppression that we saw at Tiananmen Square and that we've seen in various other contexts from Beijing. That's somehow to do with the free market system, with capitalism. Because, of course, when we're talking about these 8 immortals and their progeny controlling hundreds of billions, trillions of dollars, ultimately, if we include the Chinese reserves, in all of these various corporations, these state-controlled corporations, this is somehow free market. This is somehow the example of capitalism. So you'll see the way that certain pieces of the narrative are inserted here to try to create false paradigms that are, again, at that 2-dimensional stage. It's capitalism versus socialism, and they butt heads, and oh, look what results. And there are other aspects of this that I think are worth highlighting. For example, when Heinz Kissinger himself poses something that I think is also becoming another idea that is pushed in this China versus the US narrative, which is that, well, you know, when you think about it, militarily, from the perspective of empire, the Chinese are kind of the good guys.
the Chinese believe in the superiority of their culture, the uniqueness of their culture, and they are delighted and proud if you respect it. But there's no way you can become a Chinese. It is not if you are not part of the Chinese culture and born into the Chinese culture, you cannot become one. So it's hard to imagine Chinese armies intervening somewhere to make Chinese culture or Chinese governing principles. That is not a Chinese way of thinking. The Chinese way of thinking is that the majesty of the Chinese conduct and the achievements of Chinese society will inspire respect, which leads to a cooperative action. But it's not one that they have historically attempted to bring about by military force. They'll use military force if they feel themselves threatened, and ruthlessly. But it's hard for me to visualize a Chinese military strategy designed to back up a Chinese world government, even in the name of universal peace.
And so here's the narrative that becomes kind of the counter-narrative to the mainstream narrative, which is propagated in the West, which of course is that the US and NATO are the good guys in this Cold War scenario. Well, of course there has to be a counter-narrative, an alternative narrative, that is subtly injected into the conversation by people like Kissinger, who have been intimately involved with the creation of this red capitalist system since its inception, as we've already detailed in various ways, in which we will continue to detail. But he gets to insert certain things that become part of the counter-narrative as well, like, oh, well, China, they don't go out and militarily invade other countries. They're the good side of the New World Order. And so I think that's another thing that we and the alternative media really have to be careful about, is what counter-narratives are we propagating, and are they truly counter to the system that is being established? Are they truly counter to the mega-billionaire financial elite interests that are puppeteering this butting of heads of the capitalist and socialist system? Well, let's continue. What specifically resulted from these increasing ties through organizations like CITIC, which very attentive listeners of this podcast will remember from our examination of the Power Corporation and the Desmarais family in Canada, which managed to get an interest in and ultimately sat on the board of CITIC Pacific, which was a Hong Kong subsidiary of CITIC, which is the same CITIC which was Rong Yi-ren working with Rockefeller and everyone at Chase Manhattan and the 300 U.S. corporations to establish this U.S.-China tie. So again, the layers are so deep. There are so many different facets to this story, but they interlock and they are fascinating when you start going down this rabbit hole. But which notes, quote, "The Chinese industrial juggernaut did not just spring up overnight. The infrastructure for China's economic marvel of the last decade was laid in the decade before. In the 7 years from 1994 to 2001 alone, direct investment of US-based multinational corporations in China quadrupled from $2.6 billion to $10.5 billion. In the same period, China rose from the 30th largest target of US R&D investment to the 11th, on the back of a doubling of U.S. affiliates in the country. The list of companies that started major R&D activities or facilities in China in the 1990s reads like a who's who of the CFR-nested Fortune 500 set. DuPont, Ford, General Electric, General Motors, IBM, Intel, Lucent Technologies, Microsoft, Motorola, and Roman Haas all had a significant stake in China by the beginning of the 21st century. And then the economic boom suddenly springs out of nowhere, right? Interesting part of all of this is the fact that it was, of course, framed as the offshoring of productive capacity. Of course, we're using China for their cheap labor. That's why all these companies went to China. This economic marvel of China over the past decade did not spring out of nowhere. It is the end result of what has been happening for decades as part of agreements that were reached decades before that. So we have to understand this deeper level of what's going on to understand what's happening at the surface level. And that, I think, gives further bolstering to our argument that what's happening is not the 2D surface reality of nation-states pitted against each other, but the 3D hierarchical reality of the super gophers at the top puppeteering a system whereby they can play nation-states against each other to create a global governmental system that will ultimately be this merger of capitalism and socialism, this red capitalism, whatever they want to call it. And of course they will not call it red capitalism, it will not be called anything like that, but we are seeing the merger of these systems in various ways.